Dawn on the Frontier. The American frontier was not just a line on a map. It was a living, breathing force, shifting with each wagon wheel that cut a trail westward, with every campfire lit beneath a cold prairie sky. In the early decades of the 19th century, the United States was still a young nation, restless and hungry for land. The boundaries of the Republic were undefined in spirit, if not in law, and to the west lay a continent of vast plains, snow-capped mountains, and deserts that shimmered under the sun. To most settlers living east of the Mississippi River, the frontier was both a promise and a threat. It promised rich farmland, gold, and opportunity, but it also threatened hardship, isolation, and conflict. Native American nations had called these lands home for countless generations, and their lives were deeply tied to the rivers, forests, and grasslands. For them, the arrival of American settlers was not a chapter of progress, it was an invasion. In the 1800s, the phrase "go west" became more than a direction, it became an ideal. It was whispered in small towns, shouted in crowded taverns, and printed in newspapers. Land speculation companies painted the West as a paradise, while government policies like the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 and later treaties opened immense tracts for exploration. But "opened" was a dangerous word, for it often meant open for some, and closed forever for others. The land before the rush. Before the settlers, the frontier was a patchwork of civilizations. The Comanche controlled the southern plains with unmatched horsemanship, their warriors capable of loosing arrows at full gallop with deadly precision. To the north, the Lakota roamed the grasslands, following the great buffalo herds. In the deserts of the southwest, the Apache and Navajo lived by resilience and cunning, knowing how to survive where water could vanish for months. The terrain itself was as varied as the people who lived upon it. The rolling prairies seemed endless, a sea of grass rippling beneath wind-torn clouds. The Rocky Mountains rose like jagged teeth from the earth, crowned with snow even in summer. Rivers like the Missouri and the Arkansas served as both lifelines and barriers, their waters swift and unpredictable. To venture into these lands without preparation was to gamble with one's life. And yet, the pull was irresistible. Fur traders, known as mountain men, were among the first non-native people to push deep into the interior. They were a strange breed, solitary, rugged, and often half-wild themselves. Men like Jim Bridger, Kit Carson, and Jedediah Smith became legends, living for months in the wilderness, trading with native nations, mapping unknown trails. Their journals, when they wrote them, spoke of danger and wonder in equal measure: grizzly bears that could tear a man apart, storms that blotted out the sun, and valleys untouched by any human hand but their own. The first waves of settlement. The earliest settlements in the West were little more than clusters of wooden cabins, trading posts, and makeshift forts. They clung to riverbanks and prairies like fragile outposts of civilization in a wilderness that could swallow them whole. Families arrived in covered wagons, hauling what little they owned: a cast-iron stove, a Bible, a few tools, seeds for planting. Life on the frontier was unforgiving. A man could break his leg in a fall, and without a doctor for miles, that injury might prove fatal. Winters could lock a homestead in snow for weeks, while summers brought droughts, locust swarms, and prairie fires. But the settlers persisted, driven by dreams of ownership in a country where land was said to be the truest measure of freedom. Conflict was inevitable. Treaties between the U.S. government and native nations were often signed under duress or broken as soon as gold, fertile soil, or railroad opportunities were discovered. Raids, skirmishes, and massacres stained the frontier, each side seeing themselves as defending what was rightfully theirs. The lure of the unknown. By the mid-1800s, the push westward had become unstoppable. The Oregon Trail carved a dusty scar across the plains, a route followed by tens of thousands in search of fertile valleys and milder climates. Along the way, travelers passed the graves of those who had gone before them, victims of disease, accidents, and exhaustion. For every wagon train that reached its destination, there were tales of those who did not: families lost in blizzards, attacked by outlaws, or stranded without food. Yet the hardships only added to the legend of the West. It was said that the land tested you, broke you, and, if you were lucky, remade you into something stronger. And so the stage was set. The West was no longer a mystery on the far side of the horizon. It was the next chapter of America's story. But it would be written in sweat, in dust, and often in blood. In the years to come, railroads would cut across mountains, gold would be pulled from riverbeds, and cattle herds would thunder across the plains. Yet beneath it all, the original heartbeat of the land, the wind through the grass, the cry of the hawk, the endless stars, would remain, as it had for centuries. The frontier was awake now, and it would not sleep again for a long, long time. Gold, guns, and the Iron Road. By the mid-19th century, the American West had transformed from a distant dream into a fever that gripped the entire nation. What had once been the slow trickle of settlers and trappers now swelled into a rushing torrent. Two forces drove this surge more than any others: the lure of gold and the advance of the railroads. And with them came the birth of the lawless towns and dangerous legends that would forever define the Wild West. The gold fever. It began in earnest in 1848, when a carpenter named James Marshall found shimmering flakes in the tail race of a sawmill on the American River in California. Word spread quickly, at first whispered in saloons and mercantile stores, then blaring in newspapers from San Francisco to New York. By the next year, the California gold rush was in full swing. They came from everywhere. Farmers from Missouri abandoned their plows, store clerks from Boston closed shop, and even sailors jumped ship in San Francisco Bay, all chasing the dream of striking it rich. Foreign fortune seekers poured in from China, Australia, and South America, adding to the chaos. The trails west became choked with wagons and exhausted men on horseback, their eyes fixed on the glittering promise of wealth. But for every man who found a fortune in gold dust, hundreds found only disappointment. Mining camps were brutal places, a mix of hope and lawlessness. Disputes over claims were often settled not in courts, but with fists or pistols. Diseases like cholera and dysentery thrived in the cramped, unsanitary camps, felling miners as swiftly as bullets. Native American tribes bore the greatest cost. Rivers once clear enough to drink from were choked with silt from hydraulic mining, and game herds vanished under the pressure of thousands of hungry newcomers. The influx of settlers pushed many tribes from their ancestral lands, igniting conflicts that would burn for decades. The Iron Road West. While the gold rush captured the imagination, it was the railroad that would truly bind the West to the rest of the nation. In 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act, giving birth to the grand dream of a transcontinental railroad. The Union Pacific began building westward from Omaha, Nebraska, while the Central Pacific hammered eastward from Sacramento, California. The work was grueling. On the Union Pacific line, crews battled heat, dust storms, and hostile raids on the plains. On the Central Pacific side, laborers, many of them Chinese immigrants, carved a path through the Sierra Nevada mountains, blasting tunnels through solid granite with black powder and later nitroglycerin. Snowdrifts as high as 30 feet buried tracks and work camps for months. In 1869, the two lines met at Promontory Summit, Utah. The driving of the ceremonial Golden Spike signaled more than the completion of a railway; it marked a new era. What had once taken months of dangerous travel by wagon could now be crossed in a week. The West was no longer an isolated frontier; it was open for commerce, migration, and, inevitably, exploitation. With the railroads came cattle drives. Vast herds were pushed from Texas northward to railheads in Kansas, where they could be shipped east to feed booming cities. Cowboys, often young men in their teens or early 20s, endured weeks in the saddle, storms, stampedes, and the ever-present threat of rustlers. These drives would feed both the economy and the myth of the West. Boomtowns and bloodshed. Where gold or silver was found, towns sprang up almost overnight. Places like Deadwood, Tombstone, and Dodge City began as dusty clusters of tents and shacks, but quickly filled with saloons, gambling halls, and brothels. A man could lose a month's wages on a poker hand, then step into the street and settle the matter with a Colt revolver. Law enforcement was often thin, and sheriffs walked a fine line between upholding order and surviving long enough to do so. Legendary lawmen like Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, and Wild Bill Hickok became famous for their courage, or infamous for their brutality, depending on who told the story. Outlaws thrived in this environment. Jesse James, Billy the Kid, and the Dalton Gang made headlines robbing banks, stagecoaches, and trains, often aided by sympathetic locals who saw them as folk heroes striking back at corrupt businessmen and railroads. But behind the romance lay a darker truth. Life in the West was cheap, and death often came without warning. The cost of progress. As settlers poured in, the government's policy toward Native Americans shifted from uneasy coexistence to forced removal. The promise of land, for as long as the grass grows and the rivers flow, proved empty. Reservations were carved out of less fertile territory, often far from the tribe's original homelands. Some nations resisted. The Sioux, under leaders like Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, and later Sitting Bull, fought to defend the Black Hills and the northern plains. The Apache, led by Geronimo, waged a long guerrilla war in the deserts of the Southwest. These were not minor skirmishes but full-scale wars, marked by ambushes, massacres, and relentless pursuit by the U.S. Army. For many Americans back east, the frontier was a place of opportunity and adventure. For those living on it, the truth was far more complicated, a land of wealth and ruin, freedom and violence, beauty and bloodshed. By the 1870s, the Wild West had taken shape. Railroads spanned the plains, cattle herds thundered across open ranges, gold and silver poured from the earth, and towns rose and fell in the blink of an eye. But even as the world seemed to shrink, one truth remained. On the frontier, survival belonged to the bold, the cunning, and the lucky. The final decades of the century would see the West change again, its vast open spaces fenced, its tribes subdued, and its legends set in ink and dime novels. But the spirit that had driven men and women to risk everything for a chance at a new life was far from gone. The last act of the Wild West was about to begin. The last frontier. By the late 19th century, the Wild West was beginning to fade, not with a single event, but through 1,000 small changes that, together, transformed the land forever. The vast open spaces that had once stretched unbroken from the Mississippi to the Pacific were now crisscrossed with barbed wire, rail lines, and telegraph poles. The freedom of the wide frontier was giving way to towns, laws, and borders. The closing of the open range. The cattle boom that had defined the post-Civil War years could not last forever. At first, ranchers had driven their herds freely across open plains, grazing on public land without fences. But as farmers moved in and claimed land under the Homestead Act, disputes broke out. The invention of barbed wire in the 1870s gave settlers a way to fence off large tracts cheaply, shutting out both cattle and the cowboys who drove them. This sparked the so-called range wars between ranchers and farmers. Night riders cut fences, cattle were stampeded, and barns were burned in retaliation. In some counties, the violence reached the level of open battles, with hired gunmen on both sides. Eventually, the law, and the march of settlement, favored the farmers. By the 1890s, the great cattle drives were largely a thing of the past. Railroads had also changed the equation. Instead of long, dangerous trails north to railheads, cattle could now be shipped from closer depots. Cowboys found themselves out of work, drifting to towns where the only jobs left were as ranch hands or hired guns. The romantic image of the cowboy was already taking root in dime novels, but for many of the men themselves, the glory days were over. The final Indian Wars. The late frontier years were marked by some of the most desperate and tragic conflicts between Native Americans and the United States. The push for land, gold, and railroads left little room for peace. The Great Sioux War of 1876–77 saw the legendary Battle of the Little Bighorn, where Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse led a coalition of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors to a stunning victory over Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. For a brief moment, it seemed the tribes might hold their ground. But the U.S. Army's relentless campaigns, combined with the destruction of the buffalo herds, made resistance nearly impossible. The buffalo, once numbering in the tens of millions, were slaughtered almost to extinction by commercial hunters and railroad crews. For the Plains tribes, whose lives revolved around the animal, this was nothing short of cultural devastation. By the late 1880s, most tribes had been confined to reservations. In 1890, fear and misunderstanding culminated in the massacre at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. U.S. troops, attempting to disarm a group of Lakota, opened fire, killing more than 150 men, women, and children. It was the last major confrontation of the Indian Wars, and for many historians, it marked the symbolic end of the free frontier for native peoples. Taming the lawless towns. Even as the open range vanished and native resistance was crushed, the towns that had once been synonymous with violence began to change. The same railroads that brought settlers also brought judges, marshals, and formal systems of law. Once rough boomtowns like Dodge City, Abilene, and Tombstone found that stability was more profitable than chaos. Gunfights still happened, but they were increasingly the stuff of stories told in saloons rather than the daily reality. Legendary lawmen like Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson moved on, some to bigger cities, others into business or gambling. Outlaws who had once been seen as folk heroes found themselves hunted down with growing efficiency. By the 1890s, Figures like Jesse James, Billy the Kid, and the Dalton Gang were dead, their legends already being romanticized for Eastern newspapers. The birth of a legend. In 1893, historian Frederick Jackson Turner delivered a famous lecture in which he declared that the American frontier was officially closed. The U.S. Census Bureau had found that there was no longer a clear line between settled and unsettled land. The country was full. But in the public imagination, the West was just beginning to take on its mythic form. Writers and showmen wasted no time in turning the grit and blood of frontier life into entertainment. Dime novels told wildly exaggerated tales of gunslingers, scouts, and pioneers. Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West shows toured the nation, and even Europe, featuring reenactments of stagecoach robberies, Indian attacks, and sharpshooting exhibitions. The reality of the West had been harsh, dangerous, and often tragic, but the legend was one of freedom, adventure, and untamed possibility. For many Americans, that myth was easier to hold onto than the truth. Legacy of the West. The real Wild West lasted barely a lifetime, from the early settlement pushes of the 1820s to the closing decades of the 19th century. Yet its impact on American culture is immeasurable. It shaped the nation's identity, giving rise to the belief that anyone willing to take a risk and endure hardship could claim a piece of the dream. It also left behind a complicated legacy. The same expansion that created opportunity for millions came at the cost of displacing and often destroying entire cultures. The railroads, mines, and ranches built the economy, but they also scarred the land. The West was both a triumph and a tragedy, and it still is. Today, the landscapes of the old frontier remain: the rolling plains, the red canyons, the snow-capped mountains. Many of the small towns still stand, their main streets quiet but proud. Ghost towns crumble in the desert, their false front buildings and rusted tools a reminder of dreams chased and lost. The frontier may be gone, but the spirit of it, the hunger for discovery, the stubborn independence, the willingness to start over, still runs deep in the American soul. And somewhere, under the wide sky, the wind still carries the echo of hoofbeats, gunfire, and the long, lonely whistle of a train heading west.